Well, welcome. I'm Alex Moore. I'm a postdoc in the Initiative for the Science of the Past, and I'm here to present Professor Gideon Avni. Professor Gideon Avni is the head of the Archaeological Division in the Israel Antiquities Authority and a professor of archaeology at Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and he's joining us today from Dunbar Oaks, our satellite site that we love so much down in Washington, D.C., where he's a fellow. His academic interests focus on various aspects of classical, late, antique, and early Islamic archaeology, the cultural, religious transformation of the Near East from Byzantine to Islamic rule, and the archaeology of desert societies in the Levant. During the last 30 years, he has conducted extensive field work in the Negev desert, Bet Guvrin, Jerusalem, and Ramallah. Between 1989 and 2000, he headed the Jerusalem district of the IAA. And between 1996 and 2002, he conducted a comprehensive survey of excavations at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. From 2004 to 2007, he co-directed a research team on the urban centers of Palestine in the early Islamic period. He was a fellow of the Institute of Advanced Studies at Hebrew University in Jerusalem from 2000 to 2009, and a member of research groups of Hebrew University and the Israel Academy of Sciences on the formation of Islamic society in Palestine, 2010 to 2014. He is also a co-director of an interdisciplinary study on the ancient agriculture of the Negev desert, which we're going to hear more, and of the late antique and medieval hinterland of Jerusalem, 2016 to the present, and a member of the research group of the history and archaeology of the Islamic in the Levant, which brings me and him close together in research interests. Professor Avni is the author of numerous monographs, archaeological reports, articles, and popular books. His recent books include The Byzantine Islamic Transition in Palestine, an archaeological approach from Oxford University Press, and Roman Jerusalem, a new old city. Among his other works are nomads, farmers, and town dwellers, pastoralists, sedentist interactions in the Negev islands in the 6th to 8th century CE, and many more. Today, he will join us to speak about the transformation of agricultural and irrigation technologies in the late Roman and Islamic Near East. And this is a lecture, the first lecture of this semester in the series of What's New in the Fall of the Roman Empire, which has seen illustrious scholars such as Professor Kyle Harper of the University of Oklahoma, and Professor Johannes Klause of the Max Planck Institute for the Science of Human History in Jena, Germany, and our own Michael McCormack of the Initiative for the Science of Human Past. So without taking more than these 5 minutes I've already taken, I would like to welcome Professor Gideon Avni.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And it's a real pleasure and honor to be here and to share with you some ideas which basically will take us about to review changes in settlement in societies in the Near East between the 5th, 6th century and the 11th century from a very specific angle, as these are reflected from outside in, if I may say it, from the perspective of agricultural areas, fields, irrigation techniques. And the question is, what, if, has been changed during this period? The term early Islamic or Arab agricultural revolution was not invented today, and this is not a new term. And actually the beginning of this story takes us back something like 45 years ago, when a young economic historian, Andrew Watson, spent a whole year in a research center called ICARDA, the International Center for Agricultural Research in Dry Areas. This center was located in Aleppo, in Syria, and for many years it was one of the most important centers in the Near East for the research of agriculture, of plant species. It has collected something like 150,000 species of plants, modern and ancient, from all over the Near East. I just read last week a piece in the New York Times which review what happened to this center in recent years with the troubles in Syria. It was relocated in Lebanon and in Morocco, and it's still functioning. But the inspiration of whatever was written about this revolution on agricultural techniques actually was triggered by this stay of Andrew Watson in this center. And what is basically his paradigm or his ideas? It takes us to the change between Byzantine and Islamic rule in the Near East, and the basic claim of Andrew Watson was that the political, religious, and cultural change in the Near East and in the long way, the transformation from the Roman Empire to the medieval cultures was associated also with the dramatic change in plant species, in the penetration of new species, mainly from the east to the west, the introduction of new irrigation techniques following the Arab conquest, and basically changing the scope of both agricultural regimes and whatever comes out of it. The landscape, topics like dietary habits, the shape of pottery vessels, and so on. Watson defined specifically 17 species in which he studied in more focus or more precisely species like rice, the sorghum, the hardwheat, cotton, sugarcane, and some more exotic species like oranges and lemons, which appear for the first time in the Near East following the Arab conquest. To his views, the eggplants, the spinach, bananas, mango, coconut palms, artichokes, and several other species. This was one field. The other field was the change in irrigation technologies, and in the following minutes you'll see that I will be addressing particularly this field, meaning that new technological inventions were penetrating into the Near East, into the Mediterranean, mainly from the East, changing the whole concept of how the landscapes were treated, to what extent agriculture was intensified, and as a byproduct, how new species were cultivated in new methodologies like qanats. We're speaking about this innovation in the second part of the lecture, the water wheels, the norias, and so on. These ideas, which were published in a number of articles in the end of the 1970s and in this book, The Agricultural Innovation of the Early Islamic World in 1983, triggered, as expected, a number of reactions, mainly by historians. Very few archaeologists were involved in the first round of the debates between Watson and other scholars, and the question was whether these are really innovations or whether these species existed in the Near East before the early Islamic period, like in the Roman period, and there's nothing new in the use of these species. Hello, Mike. I was worried that you won't be able to read it to arrive. I hope you're okay. Anyhow, the first round of this debate, as I was saying, in the 1980s, concentrated in issues whether these species are new to the Near Eastern Mediterranean world, or are we speaking about a reuse of existing species that were already known in the Roman world. Only in 2009, Michael Decker, an archaeologist who did quite extensive work on the agriculture in the East, in the Near East during the Byzantine period, published paper in which he claimed that basically there's not so many innovations in species, in technologies. Most of them were already used before. But this topic was, if not completely ignored, it was not the focus of discussions, at least among archaeologists. And it raises some very fundamental issues in relation to the change between the Roman realm and the early medieval, the long late antiquity, what really happened in this period. And this is a topic which I would like very much to shed some light during my presentation. Of course, it has a lot of implications about the impact of political, social developments into this process, how and if the environment does play a role in this, and maybe the theoretical question of does technology drive history? What is the role of all these processes in the historical changes? There's the issue of space. Basically, Watson was claiming that the direction of diffusion is going from east to the west. He also specifies some African origin of species, but speaking on the long term, we're speaking about diffusions of plant species from the east to the west. Again, sugarcane, the mass production of cotton, according to his view, started as an eastern influences. And of course, this takes us to the big question, the differences in the connections between the Roman Empire and the early Islamic world. The open of the borders in the 7th and particularly in the 8th century created changes. You can think about paper, for example, the penetration of paper westwards. And so these topics will be actually included in a much larger discussion of space, of movement, of technologies and ideas, and also on very practical issues like the changing of dining habits, the development of the early Islamic cuisine. This is a recently published book about the foodways of medieval Cairo, which, according to Watson theory, was very much inspired by these changes. Jody Magnes, an archaeologist who worked on Byzantine and early Islamic period, published a few years ago an article which discussed the changes in the shapes of pottery between Byzantine and early Islamic, and she also adapts this Watson attitude, saying that the major changes that occur in the 8th, 9th century are a kind of byproduct of this much larger issue of plant species, new types of food, new ideas about what is good and what is better for the elites to consume as food, and so on and so on. Just before we go down to earth and start speaking about archaeology, the issue of archaeology of water management, hydraulic civilization and agriculture has been treated in some recent venues on a theoretical level, like this edited book by Joyce Marcos and Charles Tainish, in which they tried to frame the role of archaeology and particularly concerning agricultural strategies in the understanding of ancient civilization. Archaeologists are working to understand how wide range of subsistence systems managed to endure over millennia, undergoing constant modification to meet constant changing socioeconomic, climatic, and political conditions. The goal is to model long-term relationships among hydraulic technologies, economic strategies, socio-political groups, and multiply levels of decision-making. I'm not going to take us into this very complicated theoretical level, but I would like to look at the big question of change in species, in technologies, in maybe dining habits through a kind of bottom-up approach, going down to earth and reviewing some of the recent research that has been done specifically in the fields of agriculture, the archaeology of agriculture, the archaeology of water system in the southern Levant, and through this venue to address maybe the big question, can and how and in what way can new methods in archaeology contribute to these issues. Now, if we are looking about the agricultural landscape of the southern Levant in this period, basically we're speaking about two types of fields. One which is prevailing in the Mediterranean area, the terraces, and we'll go into it in a minute. And the second one, which is mainly distributed along the Rift Valley, southern Jordan, and also several places northern Syria, part of a much larger feature of a unique and sophisticated water transportation system, the qanat, the Fogara, and other names, in which I relate into in the second part of this lecture. But we'll start with the terraces. Terrace is something that everybody who traveled in different places in the world is very much aware of this. This series of pictures taken from the Mediterranean area, Peru, the Inca cultures, the Pacific area, the Philippines, they all represent a specific type of cultivation which basically want to flat area in order to create larger sections available for agriculture. And this is, of course, very widespread in many, many areas across the world. Coming to the southern Levant, and this is a picture that was taken in the hill west of Jerusalem in the 1940s. It has been estimated that up to 60% of the total area of the landscape was terraced in a very systematic way, as you can see in this picture. Basically, we're speaking about hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of miles of built terraces, which involve a huge amount of manpower. And this goes as well to the steppe and desert areas of the Near East, this picture taken from the Negev highland, which basically adopt the similar system of terracing in order to create available space, enough land to cultivate a certain area, of course, to meet the needs of nearby villages. So the first question, as archaeologists, we ask, how can you date a terrace? This is the beginning of any discussion if you want to create the basic concept of settlement system, of a period of time and of changes. So how can you date this man-made feature which is common all over the world? And of course there are the traditional accepted paradigm which say that terrace construction has completely altered the natural landscape. You can see it in this picture. Terrace construction has expanded significantly the availability of arable lands, which means that if you have a steep slope, you can create from this slope a decent amount of arable lands. And terrace construction represents technical abilities that demand long-term investment and social integration beyond the household level. It's not up to one family. It's a social level of a village, maybe of a state in larger capacities. And the common assumption which was accepted unanimously is that the expansion of terraces should be associated with settlement increase and demographic growth. And most of traditional archaeology is working according to this paradigm. I'm bringing you just an example from a very large regional survey and excavation project, again conducted in the hills west of Jerusalem, in which you have a terraced agricultural field in a very wide area, something like 35 square kilometers, which were systematically mapped, terraces and installations. A very wide network of wine and oil presses, all of them dated to the Roman and Byzantine period. Again, using traditional archaeological methodology, which brings us to the conclusion that the whole system should be dated sometime between the Roman and the end of the Byzantine, early, or let's say 1st century before Christ, up to 6th and 7th century after Christ. But what happened when you have this surrounding? And this is not a theoretical picture, this is actually what happened when you have fields which are related into settlement sites from different periods. So you have an Iron Age site, you have an early Bronze, you have Roman, Byzantine, early Islamic, and so on. How can you date the existence of terraces, and how can you relate the expansion or contraction of terraces into a specific period? And then again, we come to the traditional methodologies. So the pottery is absolutely not reliable, because the whole earth movement, which involved the construction of terraces, usually goes to places with a lot of pottery, with a lot of organic material and so on, so they move them from place to place. This has been proven in Greece by Susan Alcock, Cherry and Davis and other. The relative stratigraphy, if you have a terrace that covers an earlier building, so the terrace should be later than the building. This is rule number one in archaeology, but you don't have this. In many cases, you don't have earlier buildings. Building techniques and architectural styles for something that run all over the world, from China to South America, again, a very problematic methodology. The relation of nearby settlement, this is actually the main methodology being used. You put ourselves in a kind of circular argument. The settlement is well dated, but who say that the terraces are from the same period? Sometimes they use C14 from the fields. Again, the same problems as pottery. The field could have been transported from other places. In the last something like 15 years, a new methodology has been adopted for agricultural systems, not only in the southern Levant, Israel, Jordan and Syria, but in other places as well, the optically stimulated luminescence. What does this mean? It is based on the sampling and measuring the radiometric signal in a quartz particle that were sealed in a field. Once you sealed a piece of land or earth in a field, the quartz particle which were exposed previously to the sun start ticking like this radiometric clock. Since the major source of soils in the southern Levant hills and desert, including the Negev and the Judean highlands, is aeolian dust, which includes a high percentage of quartz. This dust has been blown from the surrounding desert in the last glacial times before the Holocene and during the early stages of the Holocene. It contains up to 1/3 each of quartz, which gives us a very good material for dating. Now these quartz particle within the earth has been transported and was well bleached when deposited. And once placed in terrace field, it is exposed to light and bleached again, and this provides us the possibility to date the terraces from the times of construction up to the recent use of a certain terraces. Now, with this knowledge, we developed two different projects which targets was some of the major questions about settlements and societies in the desert and arid areas of the southern Levant. The Negev highlands, and the question whether the source of agriculture in these desert societies are coming from the south, like the myth of the Nabateans, the desert dwellers that settles, or are we speaking about basically a Roman phenomena that was imported to the north? And this question was not asked only in this region. When you go to the literature of North Africa, for example, which has similar very large agricultural complexes, Brent Shaw and other scholars presented the question about the origin of the agriculture, the food basket of the Roman Empire. Is it coming from the Mediterranean Roman concept, or are we speaking about desert influences? In this particular area, the dating is crucial, because we do know the span period of the existence of this desert culture and the penetration of the northern cultures, the Mediterranean one, if you want, the Roman inspired one, into the desert areas. And the Negev highlands provide a very large network of fields which are excellent case studies for the use of OSL sampling in dating the field. But this is not such an easy story, because the cycles of deposition and erosion in this area is so extensive that you have to be very careful if you want to trace a specific period in which you want to relate to, because the deposition is being taken away and erodes very quickly. Even in modern time, the rate of erosion is something like 10 meters per year, which means in several decades, all this very nice less deposit could be driven away. And then you have modern agriculture, which uses the same fields and then turned over the earth, and then the whole issue of OSL and the use of quartz become irrelevant. So basically what you need in order to conduct such a research is, first of all, a good geomorphologist, which will be able to tell you the sequence. You need an archaeologist, of course, which will look at the terraces and will date them. And you need a very large sampling of OSL. It's not enough in one site. It's not enough in one specific place. You need to take several sites in a given region. You have to take very large sampling in order to get results. The field work is quite easy, drilling from the top or looking at existing sections, and the name of the game is not exposing anything to the sun. You have to do it in complete darkness in order to get good samplings. And in this particular project we approached the 300 samplings from 6 different locations throughout the Negev highland. To make a long story short, we did arrive into quite specific conclusions which relate to a very large area, actually many parts of the Negev highlands, which says that the ancient agriculture, whatever is being seen today, started not earlier than the 4th century. That was probably the final blow to the Nabatean myth about the creators of agriculture in the desert. Because in the 4th century, the Nabatean realm or kingdom or whatever you call them was not exactly relevant to this area. The most interesting point was the ending of the process, the 10th or the 11th century, way beyond the end of the Byzantine period, the Islamic conquest, and so on. So we have like an uninterrupted sequence of use between these periods. As you can see in the reference, there's an archaeologist, this is me, there's an OSL people, and then another geomorphologist who has the same name. This is not my wife, this is my brother, who is a geomorphologist. So we are signed in many of these papers. So then we have a conclusion about the time of existence, the sequence, and the durability of this system, and you can reconstruct according to the fields also the settlement system, going vice versa. It's not like the dated settlement will give you the date of the field. The field reinforced, dated, achieved from the settlement, and now we have some better views about the farmstead and the agriculture of the Negev highland. These are work that were done years ago. Then comes the next step, which is is being conducted right now. If you go to the largest settlements of the Negev highlands, like one of the best examples of the dead cities of the Negev, the city of Esbeita, Shivta, and you try to look at the agricultural systems around it and at remains of dumps inside the city, and this is the project that is being done in the last 3 years. It's going to last until 2019. It's an ERC project on the Byzantine Archaeology Research Program in the Negev, and the strategies of this project is not to look on monumental remains, churches, houses, and so on, but to concentrate on the dumps of the city and on the terraces and agricultural systems around the city, producing mainly the remains of plants. So we have, for example, peaches, dates, of course, grapes. One of the conclusions is going to be the development and the durability of the vines plantation around Shivta. I didn't mention that Guy Baoz from Haifa University is leading this project with a very large team of scholars doing mainly archaeozoology and archaeobotany. And the idea is reflecting to Watson's thesis. Are we speaking about a revolution or about a continuity of the process? If you look at the terraces dating, there's more continuity than dramatic change and revolution. And the question is, did the species themselves changes between the 4th or the 5th century and the 11th century? So this is the story of the Negev. Now, with this knowledge, we went to the north, to the Mediterranean area, adopting the same dating technologies on terraces in the hinterland of the Jerusalem, from Jerusalem to the west until the coastal plain. The first project was conducted near Jerusalem, in the area of Amat Rachel. The idea was to get the earliest dating possible for the terraces. Everybody was looking mainly to the Iron Age or to the Roman period to see evidence of cultivation which related to the settlement of these two periods. But unfortunately, sometimes the results does not meet your expectation. You are trying to look at, you're starting from period A and you're trying to reach period D, and then suddenly a C appears, which takes you to completely different direction. Now, the first dates that were achieved from this preliminary work were concentrating in two main periods. One of them more or less correlating the results from the Negev, speaking about the 4th, 5th century up to the 8th, 9th century, but this was only one site. The results were not so conclusive, but the more interesting part of it was the very intensive late use or late creation of these terraces, which took us to the Mameluke, early Ottoman, 14 to the 16, 17 centuries. The results were received in some kind of, it does not make sense because it does not correlate to the wave of settlement. So then we took another step with the much widening of the research into 8 different points or sites, all of them located in the same surrounding, west of Jerusalem, a very large sampling of the OSL, the same methodology I showed you before, looking at the existing landscape of traditional agriculture and trying to date. You can see these probes here and there, which aims to date the stages of construction of use of terraces. So this is one typical site, which includes both surveys to get the shape of the fields and the terracing. I don't know if you can see the numbers, but they go from about 200 years BP before present up to the 700 year before present. Unfortunately, nothing of the Iron Age or the Roman period. So, which means that basically all what you see now when traveling in a very large area, the Judean hills, the Galilee, the first sampling in the Galilee, maybe the Lebanese area, should be dated to a very late period. It does not say that there was not a previous stage of use, which was probably completely eroded. And this is what we are trying to look now, but whatever is existing now is very late. This is a typical square which starts with the natural soil, the Pleistocene or the Holocene. There is traces of first construction of terraces in the Roman period, very, I would say, poor traces. Again, it does not say that there was no cultivation in the Roman period, of course, but then you have a second construction in the Middle Age and the massive, the most evident construction in the Ottoman period. And this is a result of about 6 sites. You can see here the periods. One concentration in the early period until the Roman period. There's a question about the medieval results, which are not showing consistency so far. This is a kind of preliminary stage, but it is a very conclusive result about the later stage. And then we come again to the question, okay, this is a continuity or a revolution considering the periods we are speaking about. So the preliminary conclusions are, first of all, we do have a reliable methodology by which terraces could be dated. And again, this has been adopted recently in Greece, at least in one project. So we can look at the relationship between settlements and agricultural fields from a different perspective in any given period. Speaking about these two particular areas which were explored, so we do have a very clear picture about the Negev highlands, 4th to 10th or 11th century. We do have a clear picture about the late cultivation of the West Jerusalem, the Mediterranean hinterland, and this opened the way for a new project which is conducted in collaboration with Professor Bethany Walker from the Center of Islamic Studies in University of Bonn, looking specifically about the Mamluk and early Ottoman period, which is a very interesting period. I'm not going to speak about it here, but if you look at the books of Jeffrey Parker about the crisis, Sam White and other recent literature which has been written about this period, so maybe we have another, if you want, proxy or another indication about something really important that was going on in the southern Levant between the 14th and 18th century. But we are going back to the question of the early Islamic revolution. Speaking about terraces, now we come to the second feature, which involves much innovation and new aspects in this region, and this is the issue of the qanat and fogara, many other names used, just to give an idea how does it looks like. This is one a typical air view from the Iranian plateau, like mole holes or rats holes in the ground, highly visible from the air. And we are speaking about a specific technique of drilling and actually excavating underground tunnel for long distances, technology which was developed in the highlands of the Iranian plateau or near the Persian Gulf. And the reason is quite clear, I believe, from this cross-section. The reason is transporting water for irrigation and consumption for large distances from an existing aquifer somewhere in the mountains in the left side of the picture, in order to provide irrigation area in nearby and sometimes in far away locations, which use the natural aquifer, transporting the water through these man-made facilities or man-made invention of the qanats. There's been quite a large literature about the origin and the spread of qanats, the book by Henry Goblot back in 1979, and all these references and many others that you see here. The main idea is that there is a central origin and then a spread to other regions in the Near East. And the question is, of course, what should the question relevant to our topic is, what is the chronology? When this was done, can we trace the diffusion or spread from the origin into different destinations in the Near East and beyond? Because the feature of this qanat system spans in much larger areas beyond the Near East. By the way, in 2016, it was declared as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, a system of qanats in Iran. But when you try to trace the qanat system globally, you start in the east, in the Turpan bases, Xinjiang, Western China, with a very extensive network of qanats. This is one example, this is another example, hundreds or maybe thousands of miles of underground tunnels which were constructed, and the question is when. If you ask Chinese sources, they take you, of course, to the Han Dynasty, because everything should be taken to the Han Dynasty, the period in Chinese history. If you look at a very few modern scholarship which try to date the qanat from documents from historical sources like Tombert a few years ago. We're speaking about 18th or 19th century Persian origin and very late diffusion. And to my opinion, this question remains open because there has not been yet any attempt to date this extensive system, which some of them are continuously are in use, and many other were used until the 1930s and 40s of the 20th century. There has not been yet a real project which will aim to explore and date these qanats, and this is something which is very much desired, especially looking at other areas in which we do have a concentration of qanat system. For example, Kazakhstan, quite secure connection between the qanats and the medieval, some medieval settlements in Kazakhstan and westward from Iran to, for example, the oasis in Kharga in western Egypt, in which some excavation were conducted in nearby settlements and qanat system, associating them to the 5th, 4th century before Christ. Probably the best archaeological work connected to qanat was done in the oasis of the sub-Saharan region, southern Libya. Andrew Wilson from Cambridge University and David Mattingly, in their exploration of the Fazan area, excavated, surveyed several systems, and they show quite clearly that there are several datable systems which are connected to settlements of the 3rd, maybe 2nd century before Christ, as the first introduction of qanats into this area, with a continuous use until, it is not exactly clear, but sometimes in the 10th and the 11th century. And Andrew Wilson bring also this a number of Berber legends which are connected in the feature of qanat, which was highly visible and still is highly visible in this area. And these legends tell about a queen that ruled over the town of Merton in the sub-Saharan area, and her land was suffering a terrible drought for many years. And of course, this queen had a beautiful daughter, and in order to try to solve this problem, he promised her daughter in marriage to whomever will bring water to their settlements. So 2 suitors came, one drilled at the spots and succeeded in finding some water from the spring, but the second one, which was much more clever, he tunneled a very long underground tunnel kilometers away. He reached the source and he brought water not only for the settlement but also for the agriculture, and so on and so on, maybe reflecting some kind of reality. The story of qanat takes us further west to Spain, with again the same questions. Karl Butzer suggested that we're speaking about some kind of continuity and revival of the Roman system, while Thomas Glick, who more or less devoted his life for the study of hydraulic system in Spain, claimed that this is part of the early Islamic innovation, speaking again or looking about the possibility of one source and diffusion or transmission of the system west to the Near East, North Africa, Spain, east to China, and even to the New World, because we do have a similar system, Los Puquillos de Nazca, in Peru, in the Nazca Plains, which were traditionally dated to the 17th, 18th century, like the very last lane of diffusion. But about 15 years ago, not OSL, but several C14 dating from this system revealed dates of the 5th and 6th century, which means that this cannot be part of the colonial period. And if it's pre-Columbian, then we are coming about again to the question whether we are speaking about independent invention in specific parts of the world. Now, after this a little bit long introduction, I want to take you with the same question down to the archaeology of the southern Levant, looking particularly on excavations that has been conducted in the Arava Valley, the so-called land behind Ayla, the early Islamic center of Ayla, the modern Aqaba, and the Jordan Valley. Because in these two regions, and also in southern Jordan, we do have a number of systems which are visible or were visible from the air in the 1960s, and were also excavated extensively. And the quite unique feature in these specific systems that they are very tightly dated between the 8th and the 11th century. No predated settlements and no post-dated settlements. So the first introduction of qanats and of the settlements and farmstead which are relied to them is about 100 years after the Arab conquest. The technology is not known in the southern part of the Levant before that, at least not in the desert of the Negev and southern Jordan. And these systems use a very, considerably large areas for cultivations. There has been excavation in these places in the 1970s and 80s, and as it happens sometimes in archaeology, the final reports were published only last year. So this is, the lifespan of an archaeological excavation. So we do have information, first of all, about the dating of the systems and the settlement, the inner structures of building, again, which points to a new innovation, both in the type of settlements, in the introduction of qanats in the fields. The species found there are, some of them are new, some of them are old. We have olives, we have peaches, almonds, we have carobs, we have wheat, and we do have some new species that were not known before in this area. And this is the typical structure of buildings. So far, we know about 15 farmsteads spread along the Arava and the Jordan Valley, and all of them are securely dated within this span of time. No Roman or Byzantine predecessors of this particular site. When you look into northern Syria, the site of Androna and Darin, which was excavated by Marlio Mango and the Oxford University team in the early 2000s, we do have a number of systems which are related to this settlement, which start in the Roman going on to the Byzantine, but at least two of the qanats are dated sometimes after the 6th, between the 6th and the 8th or maybe 9th century. We do have the preliminary publication of this system. The so-called Umayyad palaces, Qasr al-Sharqi, in the desert Syria, the work that was conducted by Denis Genequand, published in a book in 2012, and he brings the results of dated qanats. Again, we're speaking about the 7th and the 8th century. Which takes us again to the question of origin and spread, and the dating of spread, and the connection of the very large distribution of qanats in the whole Eurasian area into a diffusion from one source, independent invasion. And when you take this map with all these points and you superimpose it, the map of the early Islamic empire, Umayyad, Abbasid, they somehow correlate. It does not mean that the qanats were distributed only by the Muslims during the early Islamic empire, during the 8th century, but you do see some correlation. So maybe the idea is to reuse or to take this methodology and very widely expand it. As I say, we still need the results from Western China, which can give us an idea. We do have some results from Inner Asia. We do have the results from North Africa, the question of Spain, and so on. So at this stage is a kind of working hypothesis which has to be reinforced by facts on the ground, by more dating data, more archaeological exploration. The last point I want to stress here is the connection between the qanats and the fringe of the major farming system of the Near East. You will find this system mainly in the fringe of the deserts, be it North Africa, Southern Levant, the Iranian plateau. And if we go back to the same period which I'm speaking about, and to the very complicated questions of proxies of some kind of environment or climatic change. I brought here only one such proxy from the Sorek cave in the Judean hills, which show some draft periods in the 6th, 8th century. This is not conclusive. We have contradictory results from other sites. There is this big work, which Mike is part of it, speaking about the cooling associated change during the late antique Little Ice Age. Maybe there is some connection, but one fact is very clear. You can see this picture in front of you. This was taken in the Negev highland in 1980. Which was a very good year. Since then, there's no possibility to take a similar picture in this area because the successive drafts and the plants which were not reproduced actually make it very visible the modern change that we are going through this area. And maybe if we put the issue of qanats not only into the spectrum of chronology, diffusion of ideas, but also into the environmental issues, maybe we can provide another contribution to these topics. So to sum up about the revolution or the continuity of a system, the debate that started with Watson in the 1980s, we do see an expansion and intensification agricultural system into the desert and fringe areas of the Levant. I would say that this goes both in the Byzantine period and also in the early Islamic 6th to 8th, 9th century. The evidence of the Syrian desert, of the southern Levant, say it is, or prove this, to my opinion, very clearly, that we do see an intensification, we don't see a decline in this system. There is an introduction of new or renew cultivation and irrigation technologies. It goes with the qanats, it goes with the water wheels, with the noyas in Spain, which is a completely different but related issue. The changing of consumption and distribution of agricultural products. This is an issue that was not studied enough. And if you look at the evidence, for example, from pottery vessels, which do show a very, very dramatic change in shape, in use, and so on, it means something, the cooking and dining habits, this might be the byproduct of the introduction of new plant species. But as a rule, we are speaking in a way about a constant revolution. We're looking at the longue durée. There is a process in which innovation takes place in this specific period. New plant species do arrive. The issue of the sugarcane, for example, which I didn't have time to relate to, is a very good example of a new innovation coming to the East. And when you compare late Byzantine, 5th, 6th century to the 9th century, the sugarcane production in the southern Levant becomes very, very meaningful, from almost zero to a very significant component in the local economy. So we have to look at it both in the long durée perspective and also look at specific plant species and agricultural technologies, which is a tool that could and can be and should be used more extensively in addressing this kind of major and global questions. Thank you.
Gideon for a typically clear and trenchant exposition of the questions and the evidence, and with a lot of new evidence brought to bear on this crucial question that really is civilizational. It goes to lifestyles and economies and the gigantic transformations that mark this period from the late Roman into the early Islamic. So Gideon has kindly agreed to answer questions, and if he
Yes,
hasn't
of course.
I'm still going to force him to. So the floor is open, and I think it's just wonderful that here we are guests in the Harvard University Center for the Environment, and that his questions go directly to this big area of investigation as well. The floor is open, friends.
Thank you for a very interesting talk, as usual.
Yeah.
I have a comment and
Sure.
follow-up question. I think this definition of revolution is also a problem because when technology exists, it can be used at different scales. So
Yeah.
the scale of use is also not taken into account. So the revolution might be just the scaling up of what is known. But so I like to talk about cotton because among all these summer cultivars, it looks like cotton has an earlier history
Yeah.
because of the recent
Definitely.
mass production. How do you see the cotton?
Could you
Because of-
clarify that a little bit for
Um,
those of us who don't know the earlier history of cotton?
Okay, so the discussion of this cash crop cultivars usually includes things like sugarcane, rice, cotton, and the cotton has a different aspect because it's a textile fiber, and it's tied to the question of mass production of textile in the Samian period, previous modern period. And well, of course, Samian textile was not known, but recent excavation in there, which is an important Samian site, has revealed lots and lots of cotton. So
From
I
which
don't-
period?
Of Sasanian period, about
Sasanian.
five, 6 centuries. So I wonder, how do you have evidence of cotton in your area? How do you see that particular expansion of use of this particular crop?
Well, first of all, I agree with your comment on the revolution, because revolution cannot be connected from other fields. The revolution changing in many fields, so the innovation should be more proper for what is going on. Now, the issue of cotton is known in the Eastern Mediterranean and the Near East also from the Roman period. I mean, there's nothing new. I think that at least the evidence from early Islamic Palestine goes to how extensive the cotton was as a component in the local economy. If you look at the hinterland of Ramle, for example, between the 8th to the 11th century, and this goes both to the source and also some archaeological evidence, cotton is becoming a kind of major field, much larger than it was before. And maybe it takes, in a way, also the place of the wine economy, if you like, during this period, which is certainly declining. So it's only not an issue of a new species that was introduced, but it's the proportion between the cotton cultivation and the cotton export, for example, even to Egypt or even to other areas in the early Islamic period in relation to the Roman period, for example.
Brian Abubush, Professor Abubush.
So, thank you for a fascinating presentation. I wanted to ask you a question about the qanats, and I understand quite possibly we don't have the text to answer this question, but in your study of the topic so far, I'm curious to know what you think about the agents of diffusion. And I ask because of the conversation we had the other week at the inaugural event when we were talking about this interesting outlier of the qanat technology turning up in Sumatra recently in the remains of the trading post that the French team excavated. So, and in that case, it looks like these are seafarers who are bringing the technology over. We don't quite know what the intention was, but
What's the date of the trading post, Brian?
Okay, thank you. This is a site that flourished from the 8th to the early 12th century, and this particular qanat technology that they found almost certainly from the 9th, 10th, or early 11th centuries, because it seems to come from Siraf, and we know the dates that port flourished. Siraf is in southern Iran. So west coast of Sumatra, we have this qanat technology turn up quite suddenly, and it's as the excavators noted, the technology is totally alien to the island. So, in the broader context of qanat diffusion, what I'm curious about, that's an a situation where it seems quite clearly that it's merchants, sailors who are doing this. But in the Near East and the Mediterranean, North Africa, do you see individual merchant initiative behind this? Or is this an enterprise that is being, is this an initiative of early Islamic government?
Well, if you take the evidence that I've shown from the southern Arava, these are new settlements that were introduced from outside the region, either as some governmental initiative to support, if you want, even the pilgrim routes from Egypt to Mecca. But this is not a kind of private enterprise, and this is also the uniqueness of using the qanats, which is a much more sophisticated system than just leveling the ground and constructing a terrace. It needs knowledge. It needs knowledge in tunneling. It needs running in the slope. It needs a much wider technological knowledge. So speaking about the Jordan Valley and the Arava Valley, it is quite clear that these were introduced within the whole settlement system by kind of governmental enterprise. It doesn't say the same to the penetration of qanats to North Africa, for example. I would tentatively, I will go more on the trade routes on the fringe of the Sahara, because if you look to Arabia, the desert oasis of Western Egypt, and the oasis in the northern Libya, they all go along this very, again, Andrew Wilson had a very nice article about it, about the development of the trade routes in the sub-Saharan area, the connection to the Gar Mountains, for example, and so on. So I would say that for sure it needed some agent, both for the knowledge and for the actual digging, but it can be variable from each area. For the early Islamic Near East, or I would say Jordan and Rift Valley, Jordan and Araba Valley, it seems like kind of a governmental enterprise which included the farmstead, the agriculture, and also the irrigation system.
So that's an interesting contrast to places like Oman, where they're few and far between, but the texts that we do have speak of wealthy merchants endowing and building these great qanats.
And Oman is also considered one of the cradles of the invention of qanats.
Has anyone tried to calculate the cost of construction of a qanat?
The work in North Africa tried to calculate how much manpower is needed, and they went to the issue of slavery. Because it's beyond the capacities of course, of a single family, of a village, and you need, they come to numbers like 100,000 day works for workers, which is beyond the capability of a local farming population, and then they're trying to look at the kind of much community or even state organization with use of slaves.
Would it be worthwhile to try to expand that work in terms of construction costs?
Definitely. Yeah, definitely. And it's not so difficult to do it because you have the whole system existing. Even by experimental archaeology, you can do it. How long it will take you to construct such a system?
Exactly. Professor
Hahn. I hope you don't mind, but I'm going to disagree a little bit with what you just said.
Absolutely. This is why I'm here.
There is an account of the digging of a qanat. There are specialists, two or three man team are the ones who dig the tunnel, and they do almost all the work, and they're paid for by typically a merchant. And the merchant typically gets the water, which is
from which period is this account?
Quid pro quo for this thing. Now, what I have never seen is an account of what the irrigation systems at the tail end of a qanat are used for. One often sees pictures of date palms, but why? What is the agricultural production used for? Is it used for trade? Is it used for provisioning of pilgrims? Is it used for, is there some sort of market involved here?
I might be able to answer about the small world I'm concerned with. Just first of all, the big issue with the qanat knowledge is the location where to dig, the so-called the mother well. Where do you start in order to locate the aquifer? This is the wisdom needed. Then once you know and you've reached the aquifer, then it's relatively simple. Now, if you relating to a question, if I'm taking this to the realities of this center in Ayla, the head of the Gulf of Aqaba in the 8th to the 11th century, and the development of farmstead around it. So the purpose is very clear. You have a growing city, a kind of both pilgrimage and commercial center, connecting Egypt, and then you have to supply it with the basic needs of food. And this is the reason why around it, into like a circle of between 30 to 50 kilometers, you will find this farmstead. And again, you can calculate the total area that these qanats were able to produce in order to grow this olive dates. Olive is a kind of problem, but dates and other. It's very. I find it much more difficult to answer a question about the North African, the Fazan area. But for this particular place, I think that.
Do you remember what the date of that text that you referred to was?
I don't remember. I'll have to. It's a modern account.
Mm-hmm.
It's very detailed ethnographically, and I'll have to go look for it.
Fantastic.
Now, I have another question, if I may, or do you want to go on to somebody else first?
Your questions are always fascinating, Bob. How can we say no?
It seems to me that the two drivers of this agricultural change are climate and, well, there are three drivers: climate, population, and markets. Sugarcane and cotton are destined for markets. So one of the drivers for those will be markets.
Yeah.
But you can't do it. Both cotton and sugarcane need a lot of water. And you can't grow them successfully without that water. And the qanats are a way to get water into areas where there is no surface water.
Absolutely.
So I've always wondered about qanats. I can add another case for you from Mexico. Does the flow from the mother well vary in time and in environmental time? Because you get major droughts in many parts of the world. What happens to the flow of a qanat with a major drought?
We may have some hints to this also from this region, because the aquifers in the Abba Valley follow a network of springs that existed sometimes until the date is not exactly clear, but sometime the second half of the first millennium, and they were dried up completely. Some of the travertines were dated in this. Now, once the aquifer goes down, the qanat is useless. Either you find another aquifer, or it has to be abandoned. Now, the reasons for abandonment of settlements in this area, which goes to the 10th, 11th century, we're going to have a big conference in Jerusalem on this in 2 weeks' time. I would suspect that, especially concerning the fringe areas of the desert, the drying up of the springs might be one major reason. I'm a bit reluctant to take this further beyond, like the big climatic reasons, but at least in the fringe reason. And concerning the levels of the aquifer, I think that this can be a direction that can be followed.
We always need more and better geomorphologists.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I just want to underscore with the climate connection. So there's a fair bit of evidence, let's say 3 or 4 pieces of evidence for the Roman period and the early Byzantine period that suggest a close connection between the decision to build an aqueduct and drought, long-lasting drought. There's a clear case from Africa that we've cited somewhere, and another one, big one, is Constantinople in the 8th century. When the emperor rebuilds the aqueduct, it's in the midst of a very long drought, at the conclusion of a very long drought. And this was spurred, the observation of the link was spurred by a French scholar who observed that the great aqueduct of Marseille, I believe, was built in the 19th century during a huge drought. So the climate connection
Yeah.
as a spur, when you have the capital
Yeah.
and you have the market, and you have the ability to do this,
Mhm.
is an interesting
Yeah.
element,
Yeah.
which is why we need dendrochronology from the Levant.
Yes, for this you need big trees.
Yeah, yeah.
So-
Many trees. Lots of little ones.
And old trees.
And all trees. They burn them all, that's a problem.
I actually wanted to agree with Professor Hunt on the fact that these things, I'm a little bit skeptical that they could be, you could increase the, just expedite the process and expand it by labor, because it's 2 or 3 man job, as you mentioned, and it has to, every shaft has to be dug one at a time, right? And after each other, and each tunnel allows for only 1 or 2 person max to go in. So basically the technology does not lend itself easily to
Unless you
the
build
use
20
of
parallel
labor.
tunnels in order to supply
Yeah, so
very large.
basically several complicated projects if you want. And in terms of its use, we have also lots of document in medieval period about the qanats being mechanism of land reclamation, because according to Islamic law, if you revive an arid land, an inhabited land, you can reclaim it. So governors that basically ruled as private basically enterprises funded lots of these things that at the end of the tale actually helped people. But throughout the process, from the entire area that was revived by these qanats was then reclaimed as the property of the ruler, and then basically documented through these back donation documents to belong to the family. For like a lot of them are still owned by the families, descendants of the ruler. There's lots of these documents.
And did the payment of the money to build it have anything to do with ownership finally?
Yes, but it doesn't, I don't think it matters how you provide, but it's basically assume that it's paid because it's professional labor, and usually they brought in professionals from different areas. Some of them were traveling.
So it also argues for a skilled labor force
Yes.
that was highly mobile.
Yes. So it depends on the scale, because we're talking about qanats. We can talk about qanats at the scale of a village for which you have local people who are able to manage it, and then we have the qanats at the scale of the cities, like desert cities in Iran. For those, that definitely they brought mobile professionals.
The scale and also the duration of use, because this multiply system, which I showed, can be misleading. Because once one system is blocked up, you just dig another one. So, and if you look at the whole span, let's say North Africa, 2nd century BC to 10th century CE, during this very long period, many qanats were constructed, not particularly in one single period. So it can be, the evidence we see on the ground can be misleading, and the possibilities to date construction and use of qanats, unlike the terraces, is much more complicated. There have been some attempts to date the spills, like if you cut the spill, but the spills have been cleaned all the time, so it doesn't say that you will trace the starting point, but only the very end phases. So it's not so easy to reach reliable numbers in a specific given period.
The whole field of dating waterworks is very complicated and very difficult.
To follow up on something you just said about qanats being abandoned, and we talked a little bit about the labor regime going into building them. What do we know about the maintenance? Because in the Roman period, for things like roads, we know that villages don't, they argue with each other about who has the responsibility of maintaining things in order. Do we have a sense of how, especially some of the bigger and longer ones of these, were maintained through time? Whether that was a state-run thing, a local thing?
You speak about the qanats or the terraces?
I'd be interested in
both.
Do both.
Well, terraces, it's much more simpler. Looking at the traditional village life, that was documented in Greece, Asia Minor, Syria, Lebanon, all over. So in the cycle of cultivation, there's a phase of repairs on the constant repairs of terraces. And this has been conducted as late as recent years, which means that you have to be at the site to be present in order to maintain this. Now, what happened in the Negev highland, which was abandoned in the 10th century, there is a project which tried to trace what happened when a terrace is being broken. So the rate of erosion of accumulated silt behind the terraces is so quick that in something like 50 years, about almost 500 meters have been eroded. So the rule of the game is all the time to keep the terraces built, and the maintenance phase, it's not such a big work, looking at the cycle of traditional agricultural life, in which you have quite long periods in which you either sit at home or you go to the terraces to repair them.
And I think the best study of this in the anthropological literature is Conklin's work on the terraces in northern Luzon.
Mm-hmm.
And it's constant work. You have to repair that, the facing wall. And I would guess that in the Near East, it's a major rainfall in the winter that's going to give you an event that you've got to go in and fix right away.
Yeah, absolutely.
The summertime is probably not.
Yeah,
Not so
yeah, it's winter and early springtime, which is the maintenance period.
I'm curious, Professor Avni, what your thoughts are on about how these agricultural changes impacted then the economies of large urban centers in the coastal plain, an area that you didn't mention this change so much.
Well, you have to look at the wide picture, because this is part of a much larger economic system. But it's quite a significant part when you look at mainly at rural societies. It affects also urban societies, because these are the breadbasket for, if you look at Palestine, the coastal plain cities, the big ones, Caesarea, Ashkelon, Jerusalem, and they had to be supported by this active hinterland. So it goes once the intensification of the hinterlands is visible, then it must show something about settlement. But if we come to I hinted about the early Ottoman period, and the reaction we are getting, some of them are quite funny, it does not make sense. Such a huge work on agriculture, were the settlements? And it's a question. And then you can go to the issues of land legislation, for example, the early Ottoman. Maybe it was needed to obtain the land in order to get the rights on it. And this is part of the work we're now doing with Bethany Walker and his team, including looking at the Ottoman daftars and this type of, because it really doesn't make sense when you look at the social structure. But we do have dates, and we do have, it's very difficult to debate. You can debate the dates that are not reliable, but we have hundreds of. But the agricultural regime is all the time connected to the main social structure of a given region. And this is the question, but for the Negev and also for the Mediterranean areas, of what happened between the 6th and the 8th century. Do we see the decline in settlement? Do we see the effects of starting again from the plague, going to earthquakes, the political change? How can we trace, can we at all trace it in changes in the landscape? Now, the main aspect that we see is continuity with some kind of fluctuation in between this period. But as a whole, looking at the whole agricultural regimes of the Eastern Mediterranean, I'm not speaking about Anatolian Greece, but Syria, Palestine, including northern Syria, the beautiful abandoned village of the Syrian Massif, you can more and more see the aspect of continuity in this whole agricultural regime, which affects, of course, the cities. If you go to Iraq, Mesopotamia, there's an article by Hugh Kennedy, Feeding the 500,000, which was published a few years ago, which looks at this agricultural regimes as a source of the existence of the big cities. So it has to be weaved into one whole picture.
You resolutely did not talk about animals in this transfer. Do you know when the water buffalo comes west, and is it part of this picture?
Well, I don't know. I know about one. This is the type of topic that the next generation, which should be here. But we do have medieval sources which mention the water buffaloes in the swamps of, for example, the Hula Lake in the northern Palestine, sometimes 10th, 11th century. But if we're asking about excavations which reveal remains of water buffaloes, we don't have them yet.
Can I ask another question? So in theory, it makes total sense that radiocarbon is not a good method for terraces. Has there been any study like yours that goes into a big area and collects C14 and see how spread they are? Just showing to show if in practice these are really spread over time or if there's any pattern.
That'd be a pretty expensive experiment.
Well, actually, I was thinking because C14 is a lot cheaper than
this new Negev project, which is funded by the ERC, and they have quite a lot of money. So they're doing parallel testing of OSL and C14.
That would be great.
And to try to see whether there's some kind of matching or you are working like this. The one project, at least I know in Israel, which used C14 for dating terraces, got some really diverse results, like pre-Neolithic data for Byzantine terraces, and it's not consistent. But what they're trying to do now in this project in the Negev, they take the same terrace, they sample in OSL, they try to sample in C14, and they try to do about matching, because they have the money.
I was just wondering, what do we know, if anything, about what do these societies learn from managing water from qanats in terms of what continues to other agricultural systems? So, for laws, institutions, norms, what are people learning from this kind of long-distance water management that they're then taking?
Well, not in the region where I was dealing. I think maybe we do have some knowledge from Iran about modern system, the distribution of water rights and like who owns the qanat and all this. But it's
not Spain with Tom Glick.
Yeah. In Thomas Glick working in Spain. It's very difficult to trace it from the things I show, except for the fact that each qanat system is connected to one specific farmstead. So it might give you the kind of ownership about not only the proper buildings of field, but also the water transportation system, but we don't have documentation on this. Not in our region.
There's extensive literature from Oman. And a lot of it is the Ibadi sect, the school of thought, their fiqh literature. It's full of case after case after case involving qanat maintenance and who's supposed to do what and who's responsible for what. And I can give you some references.
From which period? Modern?
Early Islamic. We're talking about the 9th century and onwards.
That would be very valuable. Not wrong.
But I should say, in the 9th century, when it appears, and I think Wilkinson wrote about this, as far as I can remember, it appears as a full-blown system. In other words, they talk as if they're quite used to all this, and there's a lot of long-standing practice.
Gideon, are you aware of any observations of qanats outside of the area that fell within the House of Islam in the Middle Ages in Western Eurasia? You've talked about, obviously, about Central Asia.
There are descriptions in literature, but then it's the definition of qanat sometimes go to cover the channels. So it's not like locating aquifer and then digging. For interior in Germany, there's some references of the use of qanat, which is based on the mining techniques and so on. The technology, the basic idea of technology, I think is different. The galleries in Spain, which some of them are related to canals which were covered, like the cut and cover system and not tunneling. So it goes to matter for how do you find the, if I can say, the true qanats.
But if we allow for true qanats, I mean, for example, I can't help but wonder if in Byzantine Anatolia, as they reconquer Anatolia and move towards Syria in the 10th and 11th century, whether there's any signs of this kind of agrarian technology being imported to Cappadocia.
I think that there's one reference I know of Cappadocia. I don't know if it's Bob Osterhout or others who mentioned the existence of qanats with the 10th, 11th centuries villages in Cappadocia.
Well, we've certainly milked our friend and colleague so far. I propose that we continue to milk him in the convivial circumstances of the reception next door. And in the meantime, why don't we thank him for...